Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Tony Fapiano, and I'm coming to you from actually a local restaurant. And my purpose for choosing this venue to do this program is that I have the privilege of interviewing our immediate past First Selectman, Carl Balestracci, who, as many of you know, is a local guy, has always been involved in local politics, local education, born and raised in the town, educated here. And I thought this would be a better place to do this than perhaps the GCTV studio. So, Carl, first of all, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Tony. I hope the customers can put up with us.
That's the only problem. This is school vacation week that we're doing this, so they'll probably get real busy as we go. But we tried to stay in a corner so we don't take too much business away from the restaurant here. And I appreciate them doing it as well, Lori and Jessica. Carl, let me start with just a general resume. We don't have to get into detail till a little bit later, but you were born and raised in the town.
Born and raised in Guilford. I graduated with a class of '58, one of the best classes that Guilford ever produced. I went to Yukon for a year, got very patriotic, joined the Air Force for 4.5 years, served 2 years overseas, came home, finished my college education at Southern, and as you know, because we ended up teaching together at Woolsey School in New Haven, I was special ed and worked in New Haven for 9 years before coming to Adams to teach math and history, and then from Adams I went to the high school as a house officer, and then with Barbara Truex we were co-assistant principals and then co-principals.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute. When you got through with your classroom days and you became an administrator, obviously you got a 6th year as well.
Correct. I went on, got my master's and 6th year from Southern.
Okay. What prompted you, first of all, to want to go into administration? Because I know you were a very successful classroom teacher, at least the years that you and I were together in New Haven. What prompted you to want to move on to the administrative level?
Well, I think in the beginning it was important that this was before teacher enhancement, and we not only worked every summer and every weekend and holidays and whatnot, but as you know, you get your 6th year, there's an added step, et cetera. And I thought it would be good to have that.
Back in those days, we were making millions, right?
Yeah, right. I thought it would be good to have that just in case, something came up. And then lo and behold, one of the house officer positions opened up at the high school, and I applied, and I got the job. And frankly, that was a lot of fun. I mean, I enjoyed teaching at Adams. That group at Adams, we used to call them the big green teacher machine. They had the kids for 3 years in those days, 6th, 7th, and 8th.
Well, that was before they split up the middle school.
Yeah, and we really got to know the kids well. And it was a lot of fun working with that crew. But when I went to the high school as a house officer, I had equally as much fun. I never forget the very first period, the first day that I was there. I had the kids in the freshman class I had for 3 years at Adams, and then, of course, they didn't know when they left in June that I was going to be coming to the high school. I didn't know either. But the very first day, I'm walking down the hall, and one of my favorite students, who was a fencer, came up and gave me a big hug and kiss in the middle of the hallway. And I'll never forget Connie Merman. She said, "Mr. Balestracci, we do not behave that way at Guilford High School." And the student turned around to her and said, "Well, you better get used to it, because this is Mr. B, and we are the class."
You better be careful. You know what's happening in Milford right now.
Oh, I know. But, in those days, it was different, as you know. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there was a different mentality, perhaps, towards that. Let's talk for a second again. Why did you leave New Haven to come to Guilford?
Okay, well,
I can only guess what the answer is.
No, I was very happy there. I ended up at Ivy Street School after you and I left Woolsey, and I was at Ivy for 6 years. The principal did not have any assistant. She was asking for an assistant. They finally assigned me as a crises teacher, so I ended up handling discipline problems, managing the cafeteria during lunch, etc. And then when she retired and they hired a new principal, he was out the 2nd year for 40-some days. He had bleeding ulcers and medical problems, and he wrote a letter asking that
Reminds me of Abe Fisher at Woolsey.
Well, yeah, very similar. But Carl DeCruz, the principal, wrote a letter to the superintendent asking that I be appointed assistant principal, and they refused, and it just went from bad to worse politically. But teaching and working with the kids, I loved. They were a courageous group of young people, and school was the best place for them. It was the only place they got a really, a balanced hot meal, and you know all about that. But when the position, Mr. Cull passed away on the last day of school, and what was that, 75, the end of the year, and he had been at Adams for years, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to apply. I had a grievance against the superintendent in New Haven at the time because of the situation at Ivy. We had had 2 strikes consecutive years in New Haven. There was a lot of political unrest, and I got the job. And as I said earlier, I was as happy as could be teaching at Adams. It was a great group of educators, and it was a lot of fun working for Duncan Craig and that whole crew. Was just, I look forward every day to going to work.
All right, let's move actually backwards a little bit. What schools did you attend in Guilford, starting with elementary?
Oh, well, actually.
Does it still exist?
Yeah,
It was a few years ago.
In 1945, my class was divided into 2 groups. We went to kindergarten. My group went to kindergarten in the basement of the old library, and Miss Nettleton was upstairs as the librarian. The other half went to kindergarten in the basement of Town Hall. And then first grade, we were finally together at Church Street School, which is now the community center, as you know. We were there for a couple of years. And then we went to the old Boston Street School for one or 2 years.
That's the condominiums now.
Right, the condominiums. And we were there. They walked us over to Engelman Field when they took the first scoop out for Calvin Leach School, I remember. But Boston Street School was a lot of fun. I always remember that Gladys Griffin was my teacher there, and she taught me how to read. She also was my first woodshop teacher. Her husband was a contractor, and she would bring in scrap wood and tools and paint and stuff. And on Friday afternoons, if we'd been good, we could make little things in the corner of the room, and it was just a lot of fun. She was a great teacher, and I was sorry when I went to Baldwin. She retired the same year that I went there because it would have been fun working with her after all those years. But
now, in those years, when you went to high school, the high school was Adams?
It was Adams.
Was that Adams?
I was at Calvin Leach for 1 year, and then we spent probably, 6 or 7 years at the high school, which is now Adams. There was a junior high, they called it in those days, and then we just moved up in grade to high school. Where the library is now, that was the gym. It was so small that if we had a lot of parents, which we never did, they'd have to stand up around the edge of the basketball court because it was so small. And then there was a stage down at the end, and that's where we had graduation, et cetera. We had all our dances there. And so I spent a lot of time in that building.
That brings up an interesting point, actually a controversial point in town right now, in that it was a very small situation that you were involved in. The schools were obviously antiquated. They were really old, and they didn't really have any facilities. But in your opinion, as an educator now, do the bricks and mortar really contribute to the quality of the education that comes out of the system, or is it more the curriculum and the people that are presenting the information, the teachers mainly?
Well, there's no question that the teachers are the biggest influence on an educational system and the curriculum, but the facilities augment or help or support in a very important way.
That's coming up this year.
Oh yeah. One of the things that I'm most disappointed in is that we were not able to solve that problem in the 6 years that I was in office as first selectman. Because
let me ask you about that. Just stop for a second. You're disappointed, but there's a separation between education and town government in a sense. I mean, it's all one town, obviously, and it all contributes to the quality of life in this town. But as a first selectman, you have certain responsibilities that I assumed don't really overflow into education, and vice versa. Education people don't get involved with public works.
Well, that's correct, except that as first selectman, you also are captain of the team, and you try to work with both Board of Ed and Town side It's the taxpayers who support all of the school facilities. And one of the problems that we have in Guilford, and most towns that are as old or as large as we are, have the same thing. The buildings that were built in the 1950s were built with the philosophy that they would last 50 years, then be torn down and replaced. And if you take a look at the buildings that we have, Adams Middle School today is still the best building we have in town.
Built what, in the 30s probably?
It was built as a WPA project. It opened in 1937. It cost, by the way, less than $200,000, including all the furniture.
Those were real dollars in 1937.
Right. But it has pitched roofs. It's brick. It's just a wonderful building, and it was built to be maintained, not to tear down and be replaced. And I don't think we should ever tear it down. I don't think we should ever give it up. If it's not used forever as a school, it certainly could be put to many uses in the town. But the buildings,
For example,
I remember.
talk about senior housing,
Well, I remember
community
Dick
facilities.
Beatty and I, when he was chairman of the Board of Ed, and I was first selectman in the first go-around, we talked about the ground level being used for all-day kindergarten or a real community center for young people. Because the community center that we have, as you know, the parking is limited. That would make a wonderful senior center someday in the future. We could use the old section of the Adams School for municipal offices, Board of Ed offices. Right now, the Board of Ed has their administrative personnel in 3 or 4 different locations. They could all be put, in one area. So there's a whole lot of different uses that building could be put to, if the decision is ever made that we need a new school to replace it. But the buildings that were built in the 50s, especially the high school that was opened in 59, or the students went in 59, flat roofs in New England, how many times we replaced those roofs, and the corridors are too narrow. One of the philosophies was, when they built it, that all the windows in the corridors would give you passive heat from the sun. Well, those corridors, as everyone knows, are so cold. There's no air conditioning up there, and when you open school at the beginning of the year now, or in the month of June, to try and teach and then have the kids taking these tests that are so important at the end of the year, it's just a very difficult situation. So instead of supporting the quality of education, at this point in time, it really is detrimental, because when the kids are sitting there in a room and it's almost 80 degrees and they're trying to take tests or concentrate on the end of the year activities or studies, it's just very difficult. So, those will have to be addressed. And as I said, the taxpayers pay for all this. So even though the Board of Ed is separate from the town in budget and whatnot, it still is all one community. And that's the way we should think about it and work.
Seems like over the years there's been widespread support for the town side of the budget, and education has the naysayers and the supporters. It has both. What do you think that is? Why do you think that there's almost uniform acceptance of the town side, but some resistance to the education budget?
Well, that feeling ebbs and flows, and for a time...
That changes over time, too, yeah.
We didn't have too much...
I'm trying to do my Mike Wallace thing now.
We didn't have too much support when the first idea for
Mike Wallace
education budget went down to defeat. But now there is a very strong young parents group supporting it. As far as support for the town side and not support for education, when that does occur, I always like to go back and say to people, think of what the education system in this town does for this community. Not just that it's good for real estate values and people want to move to Guilford for the school system, but look at the people who serve Guilford, for instance. How many of the last half dozen first selectmen and members on the board of selectmen are Guilford grads? Our police chief, our assistant police chief, half the police force. Same thing with the fire department. I'm very happy that I wasn't an administrator at the high school in 1971 when Charlie Hershaft and Tommy Terabaugh both graduated, but it must have been a tough class. But the fact of the matter is, Guilford should be proud, and sometimes I'll go to the diner, the deli up on Route 1 in the morning, and all of the tradesmen that come in there are former students. I mean, it's like an alumni meeting in the morning, and the repartee, but the electricians and the carpenters and the plumbers, and it's incredible the number of people who.
That's why you can't get a plumber when you need one. They're all having breakfast.
They're all having breakfast.
I'm just kidding, Paul.
And it's and doctors and lawyers. The head of the ethics commission had the highest average in my 7th grade civics class. Jeff,
Is that right?
Jeff Beatty.
Jeff?
Yeah, I saved all my old grade books, and when Kaylee's Pub opened up and Jeff Potham was over there, I brought him the page. I made a copy of it because he was a B-plus student. He was pretty good, but Jeff had the highest academic average of anybody in the 7th grade that year in my civics class. And here he is. He's not only a lawyer with his dad, but he's chairman of the ethics committee, and it's great.
And does a great job, I can tell you, as a member of that.
And it's so heartwarming for me to go to these people and say, I need you to look at this and advise me, as old as I am, having had those kids in 7th grade, and now, they're showing me or.
But those are examples of why the education system is so important and why it should be supported more widely spread than what it is, perhaps.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a tough situation coming up. I mean, there's going to be a battle, but at the end of the day, you're right, something needs to be done. I mean, there has to be improvements made.
Maybe, and I don't think $110 million is going to pass for a bond issue, but maybe it has to be done over time. But you can't neglect your facilities. You need to upgrade them and have long-range plans just like you do for any other department.
How did the Balestraccis come to Guilford? How did that happen?
In 1937, my father answered an ad in the paper for a ditch digger.
Where was your father living then?
He and my mother were married in 36. They were living in Stony Creek. My father was opening oysters for a penny apiece, and working on one of the thimbles. He did several things, but he answered an ad for a ditch digger on Saturday. Mr. Whitehead, who owned what's now Clinipad, put the ad in, and he came to Guilford and made $7 digging the ditch all day Saturday, and Mr. Whitehead asked him to come back on Sunday, which he did. He made another $7, and Mr. Whitehead never let him go. He gave my parents a building lot where I grew up for free.
Where was that?
On Halleck Street, right alongside the side driveway to the factory. And when Mr. Whitehead gave my parents the building lot for $1, he had to give them $1 for legal fees. Judge Conway, who was Mr. Whitehead's lawyer, said, well, if that so-and-so can give you the lot for $1, I'm only going to charge you $1 for the legal fees. So for $2, my parents got a building lot, and they ended up starting the house in 1941, and I was a year old and lived there until I went into service.
And I know I've read somewhere that your grandfather worked at the quarry, the Stony Creek quarry.
My grandfather, Aldo Balestracci, came to America in 1911. My grandmother, they had one daughter, Adelaide, who was about 3, I think, at the time. My grandmother was pregnant with my father. When my grandfather left Italy, he, of course, hadn't even seen my father yet. And he came and worked in Niantic for the gray granite quarries over there, earned enough money to send over for my grandmother, and they arrived through Ellis Island, like my grandfather did, and then shortly after that they moved to Stony Creek, and I think my grandfather Aldo worked in the Beatty quarry for a while, and then they actually had rented a room from the Weiner family on 146 in Stony Creek, and they shared, the same table, and they'd have the Passover dinner on one holiday, and they'd have Christmas dinner on the other holiday. And when my grandparents were able to buy their own building lot, the Weiners gave them a cow to bring with them because they said they'd need fresh milk, for the growing family, and then they moved to their homestead in Stony Creek.
I did not know your father, but I knew your mother actually. From your mother worked at Fleischmann's for
Yeah, for a lot of
a
years.
lot of years, right?
My parents in 1948 bought or rented space from John Sullivan up on Route 1, but they had a mom and pop grocery store, fresh meats and fresh produce from Guilford farmers and stuff. And we had that business for 20 years. And I say we because I was only 8 when they bought it. But by 9, I was working in the shop. They had to fold the apron up 3 times so that it wouldn't drag on the floor for me. But I worked there. We opened first till 9 o'clock on Friday night. Then we changed and worked 8 till 8 every night. And then we even, at the request of some of the old Yankees, opened up on Sunday from 8 to 1. So it was a 7-day-a-week business. And
I love hearing these stories about the old days in Guilford. As you may know, I did a similar interview with Gene Bishop when he left the first selectman seat as well. And I love you talking to old Guilford, not old, but old in the sense that you've lived here your entire life, and getting a sense of what the town was like 20, 30, 50, 60 years ago. And I mean, population-wise, back then,
all the years going through school is about 5,000. Before 1950, well, we graduated in 58, but that's when the highway opened up.
everybody says I-95 did it, right?
It really did. Guilford then became a home or a bedroom town for people who had to commute to work, whether it was New Haven or New London. It just made Guilford much more easily accessible. But it was such a different town back then. In the 1950s, Les Dudley was the first selectman all the years that I grew up and even went into the service. He was first selectman for 24 years, and he took over from his father. His father finally quit because he got in a fight with the Board of Finance.
I'm trying to think. I came in 1973, and I think Marge Schmidt.
Yes.
Marge Schmidt was first selectman.
Right. She was the first.
Maybe the first woman to hold that office.
First and only woman, right? And she was great. She was a Vassar grad. She had a pilot's license. She was just a wonderful, wonderful person and a good administrator. But she was a Democrat, so they only let her stay in one term.
Things definitely have changed. I mean, population in '73, I think, was around 10 or 11,000. It's doubled.
Well, and now we're approaching 23,000. Morning. How are you?
Yeah, you're going to have a lot of that. We're in a local restaurant, so as people come in, here's Carl. They're probably a little hesitant to come over and get into the camera shot, but they're over there.
The other, one of the other differences back in the 50s when we were kids, you could ride your bike all over town of Guilford, up to North Guilford and back and down and around, and go skinny dipping at Blatchley's or whatever, and parents never had to worry. And a lot of times I'd get back to the store at noon for lunch or whatnot in the summer, and my father would know exactly where I was because the chief of police had been patrolling and said, I saw young Carl up and,
It was a different world, not only a different Guilford. I mean, the influences on kids, when you and I were growing up were so benign compared to what kids are exposed to today. I mean, it's unbelievable. But, okay, let's move forward again. After you left your classroom teaching, you became administrator of a couple of different situations. Talk about those.
Well, I went to the high school in '83, I believe, to take over from a house officer who had moved closer to his hometown. And then the following year, the other house officer position opened up, and I asked Barbara Truex if she would be interested, and she was. And so we ended up serving as East and West House officers, and we both had to teach. She was teaching advanced math, I was teaching history for 1 or 2 classes a period, but we had to do all the disciplining and whatnot. And it was tough back then. Smoking was allowed at the high school, and it was very difficult to differentiate between a Camel cigarette and a funny cigarette. And so we were very, very busy. When the assistant principal took a different job, we volunteered to become co-assistant principals with no real cost to the town. We just divided up whatever the difference was in stipend between house officer and...
Now, whose idea was that?
Barbara and I talked about it, and we said, we could easily take over the job of assistant principals and still do our house officer job, and it would save money for the town, and it was very successful. Newton Mead was the principal. We worked.
Would that system work today?
I don't know. I'm not that familiar with the high school right now, and I'd hate to make a judgment based on my experience back in the '80s to what's taking place today. But then when the superintendent changed and Newton Mead wanted to go back into the classroom, we volunteered to serve for 1 year as co-principals while the Board of Ed searched, for a new principal. And it was so successful that the Board of Ed decided that they would keep us on as co-principals. And we did that for another 4 years, hired a new superintendent, and then finally we were going to begin the 10-year evaluation. And it was the only co-principalship in the state, and people were nervous about that. And I used to explain that it's like a marriage. If it works, it's really good, and I can see if it didn't work, it would be a real pain. But ours worked. But anyway, we decided we'd break up, and Barbara and I talked about it, and I said, if she wanted to stay at the high school, Peter Madonia was leaving Baldwin to become assistant superintendent, and so I went to Baldwin for 3 years and took over. Ann Snerkowski was appointed as my assistant principal at my request. And then when Duncan Craig retired from Adams after a long, successful administration there, the decision was made to replace him with a woman who had no public school education, and she really didn't work out. So near the end of that year, I volunteered to go down to Adams for whatever amount of time it would take the Board of Ed to find a replacement for Duncan, and I ended up staying there for the last 6 years of my career because we were able to organize the parents and reorganize the curriculum and develop team teaching. It was a big challenge.
What year was that?
Let's see, I retired in '99, so it was this
11 years ago.
'93, yeah.
Now, you're a relatively young man at that point.
Oh, thank you.
Then. You're pretty old now, Carl. You've gotten older. Yeah. So have I in 11 years. But, relatively speaking, that was a young age to be retired.
It was. We had an early retirement incentive, and
take somebody like Donald Beckler, who's doing camera for. He'll work forever. He'll take any job anywhere right now. He's retired from his career, but he just loves working.
But anyway, I took advantage of the early retirement. I've been teaching and administrating for 32 years, but I also, because of my military service, I was able to buy in a couple of years for that. So it just worked for me, and I knew I wasn't going to sit home and do nothing. But
all right, now enter politics, because now you're home, you're retired, and this is when you had actually served on a number of commissions, I guess, over the years while you were teaching.
Right, I had been a police commissioner for 19 years, and prior to that, I was on the police building committee that.
I did a video with you back then when you were moving out of remember that?
I think, yeah, that's right.
They sat me in the jail cell and videotaped me. I'm going to be there someday, probably.
Going back to my parents' store and growing up there, that was like the old corner store in the old days. If Les Dudley came in, if Les Spencer from the West Side came in, if the Dudleys from Clabberth Hill came in, it was talk about politics every day. And my father had a strict rule with me. He told me, he said, you keep your eyes and ears open, and he said, you keep your trap shut. Just listen and don't talk. But
did you pay attention?
I had to. I didn't have any choice with my father or my mother. But it was an educational program for me to listen to these people and how active and involved they were, and how knowledgeable they were about town government and town workings and whatnot, and how committed all of them were. They all had served on boards of selectmen or different boards and commissions. Like Ray Dudley from Clabberth Hill was chairman of the Board of Ed at the time, and on and on and on. It was just, and Dr. Adams would come in every day, so that it was just a natural thing for me to be interested in that, and then loving history the way I did and teaching it and whatnot. It was a natural move to go into politics.
Yeah, you strike me as a fairly sensitive guy, Carl, and I mean, I've looked at politics too, and it seems that I don't know that I could handle the bumps in the road. I don't know that I could handle the naysayers and the problems that are brought from people that, in many cases, don't really have all the information. I mean, I'm the type of guy to probably go over the table at them. So, what? I mean, you had to be thinking about that. That this is, it's different. Different than teaching.
Oh, it is. My Aunt Ann was the first one that said to me when I told her I was thinking of running for first selectman. She said, "Do you really want to do that and have all these people say bad things about you?" And I said, "Well,
You're not going to satisfy everybody.
No.
No matter what decision you make, some people are going to be happy with it, and some people are going to be unhappy."
But I learned that being principal of school. Every decision you make, someone thinks you're great, someone thinks you're a bum. You just have to make the decisions based on what you feel is, the right thing to do. And I had taken 3 leaves of absences while I was teaching in New Haven. The first to work for Senator Ribikoff. Actually, in '67, '68, I partnered with a couple of young lawyers to start the Robert F. Kennedy for President Committee for Connecticut. And one was Bill Mack, who was town chairman in Guilford but worked in New Haven. And the other was this young guy that worked at Wigan and Dana named Joe Lieberman. And then when Kennedy was assassinated, we talked about what we were going to do in politics and if we were going to quit. And it was such a discouraging time with Martin Luther King, and this was the second Kennedy. But we decided no, that we wanted to stay active. And so I took a leave of absence to work for Abraham Ribikoff that year. He was running for the U.S. Senate. It was a very controversial campaign. He had stood up against Mayor Daley on television at the convention and talked about the...
It was unbelievable. I remember that. Yeah, he pointed them right out.
Right.
And they were screaming back at him.
And there was a lot of anti-Semitic feeling after that against Ribikoff. But Ribikoff was such a phenomenal leader. He was such an intelligent man and such an ethical man. And we just hit it off. I mean, I was just an advanced man. I didn't make any big decisions or anything, but he really liked me. We got along very well. And 2 years later, he called me and said that he had secured a position for me working for Mim D'Addario. Now, Emilio D'Addario was just probably the most capable man that ever lost the governorship in the state of Connecticut. Oh, he was a Wesleyan grad. He won the Legion of Merit in World War II. He worked for the OSS. He had helped negotiate the surrender of all the Nazi troops in northern Italy. He was just incredible, and he had been the youngest mayor of Middletown and whatnot, but he got involved in Democratic politics and the fight for the chairmanship, and the Democrats actually did him in. But then 4 years later, I was asked to work for Ella Grasso when she first ran for governor, and I served as her scheduler, and then the last month of the campaign, her driver quit, so I ended up going on the road and being her driver, and my mentor came back in for a while and did the...
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Great experience. Yeah.
She was another phenomenal leader. Tough. Oh, God. And, the nasty things people would say about her, not just the fact that she was a woman, but, that she wasn't a glamorous woman or something. I mean, just nasty things. And the same thing with Ribikoff. When you talk about the bumps in the road, I remember with Ribikoff one day we were walking across the street in Wallingford during the campaign, and somebody threw an egg at him, and I turned around. I was ready to go after him. He said, he grabbed me. He said, "Just keep walking. Don't even look back." He said, "Don't say a word." He said, "Ignore it." So all of these leaves and all of this experience, helped me an awful lot, and I just feel very fortunate to have worked for really fine people, fine leaders, whether we won or lost.
A pretty interesting time, too. That era, 60s, 70s, you're just unbelievable. Yeah. So you're a lifelong Democrat?
Yes. Yeah.
What a Democratic Party versus what your family?
No, my father actually was on the Republican Town Committee in Guilford for a while with Sage Adams, and he was involved with the fire.
Traitor.
Yeah, I know. I mentioned Judge Conway before. George Conway was, of course, lifelong Republican, Yale law graduate, and he served as Guilford's judge of probate for a while, but then he was going to run for governor, and the Republican Party brought in who became Governor Lodge. He was a movie star, and George Conway became Attorney General. And then after a couple of terms there, he was appointed a judge of the Superior Court. But in his retired years, he would come into the market with his nurse, and he always loved to do this. He'd wait till some customers were there, and he had his cane, and as he was going out the door, he'd shake his cane at me. I was stocking shelves or something, and he'd say, "Balestracci," he said, "there's only one problem with you. You're a damn Democrat." And he'd turn around and leave. And of course, the customers would be shocked out there. My mother and father would laugh. But it was a different kind of politics in those days. Joe Dolan, who was Mr. Republican for a lot of years, he had helped me when I was a senior in high school to get an appointment to the Air Force Academy. Years later, when I became a police commissioner, he'd call me and say, "I want you to take a look at this guy or that guy," and I would. And then when the Republican chairman started to give me some grief in the press and whatnot, and because I wanted to settle the contract with the police, and he said some pretty nasty things about me, Joe Dolan all of a sudden showed up at the police commission meetings. And of course, the new chairman didn't even know who he was, but he finally asked. And Mr. Dolan told him who he was, and he said, if he didn't stop messing with me, he wasn't going to be chairman much longer. But that was the way it was. You supported each other.
You also mentioned Joe Lieberman, that you in the '60s actually worked with him on different things. And what are your thoughts about him being rejected, really, by the Democratic Party and running as an independent and being independent thinking? I mean, he's got the label independent, but he's also a very independent thinker, which I can appreciate as an independent.
Yeah, no, it's Joe has taken a very different course, and a lot of people have been critical of me because I won't denounce him, and not that Joe, it's not going to make any difference statewide, but just local Democrats say, how can you still, agree with this guy or support this guy? Well, my friendship with him is personal. I remember the first time he ran for statewide office, and he couldn't come to the convention on Saturday or Friday night, and then Saturday morning. People didn't want to accept that in those days. But the fact of the matter is, Joe has been a very good friend, and the same with Senator Dodd, who's now not exactly the most popular man in Connecticut. When I did take office and I needed support for the railroad station or Faulkner's Island or whatever it was, these people were there for us, just as Rosa DeLauro is today. You build those relationships over the years. And
by the way, Donald and I, as you know, did an interview with Rosa in her office.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And you were instrumental in setting that up for us. You called me that day.
Yeah. No, she's a great.
That was fun.
Great. Yeah, she's a good person.
She had a cold that day. She was sneezing all over me, but other than that, it was great.
Yeah, no.
I hope she's not watching.
Oh,
Can I tell you a story about Rosa real quick? I was on the legislative committee for the Connecticut Association of Realtors for a number of years, and chairman. We used to go to Washington every May and lobby and visit all of our elected officials. And my role was to go to her office. And I was late for the meeting that morning, and all the chairs in her office were filled. So I'm standing. When it was my turn to speak and to talk about my particular topic, as you can see, I move my hands a lot when I talk, being Italian. She had this beautiful vase. I smashed it into 100 pieces. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should leave, apologize, or what. But she was very, very gracious, and she let me off the hook. So she was good.
Great.
I just hope it wasn't given to her by by JFK or something. Anyway, let's fast forward. Let's talk about now you're running for first selectman. You become first selectman, and as first selectman, as you mentioned, you're the leader of the team. Okay, and as the leader of the team, you're watching tremendous residential growth, the need for more commercial growth. The environmentalists are becoming more visible, and there's concern about that. And there's also the historic and the character and the nature of the town of Guilford. So you have to balance the character with the environmental considerations, with commercial growth so you can build a tax base, with the fact that you also are dealing with an explosion in population growth. How do you balance all that?
Well,
And do you? Can you?
actually, the word balance was the key
How'd
to
you like that question, Donald?
our campaign. I mean, the first thing I wanted to do was bring a stronger administrative structure to the town, to build a team spirit with town employees and department heads, et cetera, to work with the unions instead of always butting heads. It was that kind of attitude and philosophy was successful in the schools where I worked, and I knew it could be in town. And we started to work on that. But balancing the needs of Guilford with the development of Guilford, it was not so difficult to determine what we should be doing. It was just a matter of working with some goals and objectives to attain that kind of balance. We know, for instance, that Guilford is the seventh largest township in the state of Connecticut with 47 square miles. So we have problems that towns like Madison or Clinton do not have, with so much space that we just continue to build out, and we didn't want to do that. We wanted to preserve certain parcels of land, to have green belts, land that was significant for our environment. On the other hand, you need to grow as a community, and you can't just have more residential areas, but you do need the infrastructure, whether it's roads and bridges or businesses to support the needs of the people. So it is a matter of balance, and it's a matter of getting some of the boards and commissions to work together. I mean, you don't want to bend the rules for planning and zoning. You want them to adhere to the plans and the rules. But the fact that we were able to appoint really good people to planning and zoning, and that they worked hard to come up with Route 1 East, Route 1 West, Town Center South, all of these plans on exactly what kind of development Guilford wanted. We did not want big box. We wanted smaller businesses. These were definite decisions that were made based on criteria, based on what not only the needs of our people, but the desires of our people were. So we developed a plan, and we developed some goals and objectives to reach that plan. And that's why I think we were as successful as we've been. The Goss property, for instance, that was one of the most significant parcels in the town of Guilford. And I don't think I was in office a month that I hadn't met with George Goss. I mean, I knew him prior to that.
You knew him well because he spoke at virtually every town meeting.
Well, and also I own a piece of property now with my sons, but originally with my dad, that's contiguous to the Goss property. Have for years when George's father was still alive and owned the property. So, I mean, I was familiar with it, but the fact that it was along both banks of the East River, that the state owned over 300 acres of land. You talk about older folks that mentored you or that were examples for you. Mrs. Conover, who lived on the East River, and she was one of the state's first really active conservationists, won state awards and everything. She was able to convince the legislature to buy that 300 acres of marshland down by the marina. And that was the beginning of preserving that whole estuary, so that, the things that people had done prior to my taking office, the experiences I had, the training that these people had given me, and the fact that, I went into office with goals and objectives, I think helped a great deal. But balance, as you say, that is the key.
What did you think of the sales price, the purchase price of the Goss property?
Well, when you look at, first of all, I have to say that the appraisal was 80 pages long, and that the federal government was involved, the state government was involved, so it wasn't just hiring one appraiser and then, whatever that was. And as you know, it took a long, long time to satisfy all the different entities involved in this purchase. And again, the Congress was, with Rosa and the two senators, helped us with obtaining the grant. But when you look at parcels of land that have sold recently in Orange, Brantford and whatnot, it's a big price. But for 624 acres, it's a fair price. I'm just really, I can't say enough about the courage of our taxpayers that in these tough economic times, they still realize the value of all this and voted to do this.
I think that it's difficult to put we're approaching 45 minutes, Carl. I got about 900 more questions for you. we're going to try to keep this at an hour. So, Donald, I need to know when you're at 55, all right? Okay. The Gosh property, because of the non-tangible asset that it is for now and in the future, it's hard to put a value on it. Looking at it strictly from a real estate broker's point of view, I thought that given the time of the purchase and the economic environment and climate that we're in right now, I thought it was a little bit high. But I mean, I supported it. I voted for it, and even though I thought it was a lot of money, but that's behind us now. It is going to be a tremendous asset, no question. You can see the battles going on in all these towns. In Madison, they just purchased the Griswold. They had the taxpayers came out and supported that. So there's a trend moving in that direction, which, getting back to the balance, works in opposition perhaps to some plans that may be in play. In other words, environmentalists and those that want to have more open space don't necessarily fit into commercial growth. I'm on the Economic Development Commission too, and I know that becomes an issue all the time. Do we want more of this and less of that, or vice versa?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have these plans, like Route 1 East, Route 1 West, Town Center South, etc. Times are going to change, things are going to change, situations are going to change. If you have a plan to address these changes with a very clear set of goals and objectives, then you're not doing it willy-nilly. You're working, hopefully, together, to face these issues as they come up, or to plan for them over a period of time. And I think that's the difference between Guilford and a lot of communities, that we have these plans in place, that we still, even though we have our differences, we have our bipartisan approach to to solving these problems or facing these challenges. And it's so important, because we look at Congress today and it's so frustrating that they can't get together and work. Evan Baugh, who just resigned or said he's not going to seek office again, he said he loves representing the people of Indiana, but he can't stand the Congress right now. And that's the kind of thing that we should never have in Guilford. When I lost to Gene Bishop and was on the board, we worked together for 2 years in a very healthy, good way. When I
you guys know each other growing up?
Not really. Gene was just old enough, older than I enough that we weren't in school together. We weren't that friendly, but I mean, Gene is a wonderful gentleman, and he and his wife Jane, Linda and I, we have a great deal of respect for each other. When I took over the second time, I mean, it was the same kind of thing. It was a smooth transition, and we continued to support each other's projects, and because we had these plans in place. When I left office and Joe Mazza came in, we had a very professional transition. And again, for the benefit of Guilford, not for one party over the other or whatever. I mean, Joe is going to be our first selectman for 4 years, and we need to support him. He's got a very, very difficult road ahead, not just with budgets, but the lack of state aid that we're going to get and whatnot. And I think the citizens need to support the leaders when we know that they're good for Guilford, and we know that they have the best intentions, for our town. We can't be slamming each other. We need to support each other and work for the benefit of Guilford.
Well, as much as the town has grown and changed over the years, over your years, it's still a small town. And hopefully we still have that small town mentality where we can disagree, but we can have breakfast together and and shake hands and be friends and socialize. And you mentioned Linda, your wife. She's had to put up with you being first selectman and the phone ringing all hours of the night and all of that. And now that you're retired, I spoke to her when I called you to set this up, and I asked her if she threw you out yet. And she said, no, I need him around. He does a lot of chores around the house.
No, we both love to cook. She's a joy. She's really. I'm so fortunate.
It's tough on the wife too, though.
Oh,
Let's face it.
It's tough on the whole family.
I mean, I'm sure there were many, many family events you could not attend because you had to be at a meeting somewhere.
Well, and not only that, but when you say, the bumps in the road, she's a lot more sensitive even than I am, and she would really be hurt when some people would say, like I was called a traitor because I took part in a peace
Nobody ever threw an egg at you like the other.
No, no.
Not yet, anyway.
And that those kinds of things hurt. Same with our sons and whatnot. Nobody likes to hear their father or stepfather criticized, but so it is a family thing.
All right, we're running out of time here. So what I would do is, I know that over the years, I don't know if as selectman or just community citizen or whatever, you were instrumental in some of the monuments that are currently on the green. In I don't know what capacity you were doing that, if you just spearheaded a committee or if it was part of the town movement or whatever. But let's talk about some of the monuments on the green
Well, of course, that's a Guilford tradition.
and why you felt it was important.
Well, as a veteran myself, when two Korean War veterans came to me, Bill Skeevy and one of his fellow veterans. They wanted to know if it was possible to put a Korean War memorial on the green. And I said, of course. And we didn't even have a committee. We just did it. My connection with the quarry in Stony Creek, they gave me a free stone. Of course, Uncta Ross was first selectman, and he's a great friend. Public Works went over. I picked out the stone. They loaded it in the truck, and we brought it over, and our own Public Works put that in, and then we just got a bronze plaque for it. At the same time, I recognized that we didn't have a memorial for World War II. And the whole community of Guilford worked then. Gene Bishop and the farmers produced food for the troops. We had New Departure down at where Clinipat is now. My parents worked there. 200 women worked there on 2 shifts. So we needed to address that, and that was done in the 2 years that I was out of office but on the board. Gene asked me if I would continue to work, for that, and we dedicated that during that 2-year period. And now we're working for a memorial or a monument for the Guilford Covenant. Guilford is one of only 2 communities in early North American history that has a covenant or a compact. The Mayflower Compact was the first, and Guilford was the second. And all of the heads of the towns, the Leets and the Dudleys and whatnot, signed that. We hope to have the...
Why don't you tell folks at home where that is, in case they're not familiar with Covenant, the location?
The Rotary gave $5,000 and purchased a fabulous piece of pink granite, which is native to Guilford and Brantford only, and it's 24 feet long. It's going to be cut and shaped, but we hope to have that in the triangle between Old Whitfield and Whitfield Street, basically in front of the Whitfield Museum, with the...
So right on that point.
Yeah, Covenant Point. We need to come up with a revised plan and go before the Historic District Commission. But as I said, the Rotary purchased the stone. It belongs to us. And now, if we get approval, then we'll start to raise funds to complete that. And it's significant because 2010 is the 375th anniversary of the founding of this Connecticut, state of Connecticut, colony of Connecticut. And William Leet was the first governor. And he was one of the signers of the Guilford Covenant. So in 2010, the governor, today we're having a kickoff in Hartford. I hope I can get up there. And they want to have a year-long celebration of Connecticut history and whatnot. And this would be a great activity.
So how will people at home know that this is happening? And you obviously need to raise funds to do what you need to do.
And we won't really raise funds until after it's approved by the Historic District Commission, but we'll be going before the commission. Joe Maz has asked me again to continue this and move it forward. And we'll be going probably in a couple of months. Because we have to come up with this new plan.
And that's actually, I don't know how much time we have left and how much discussion this will take, but it's kind of the gateway to the development of Town Center South.
It is.
It's on the way,
Yeah.
and sort of signals what might happen there. I know you've got the community daycare is in motion right now on the Woodruff property.
Park, yeah. It's also, with the purchase of the Goss property, the New England Trail System, which was passed last year by Congress, signed into law by the President, has become a trail system similar to the Appalachian Trail. And it comes down all through New England into Connecticut now, and then cuts across to the Connecticut River in North Guilford, but they want to have the trail come down through Guilford to the Green and down Whitfield Street to Chittenden Park and have the trailhead on Long Island Sound. So the trail, the National Trail, will go right by the Whitfield Museum and this point. And they want not only the trail for hikers, but they want historic situations along the trail to be featured. So, and I know we're running out of time. So,
I mentioned.
never let it be said that I was at a loss for words.
No, that's true. That's true. I tell you, when I picked up the equipment from Shannon at GCTV last night, she said, "Do you want a 30-minute tape, 60-minute tape, or a 90-minute tape?" I said, "Well, I'm doing an interview with Carl." She said, "You need 90 minutes."
By the way, before we finish,
Yeah, what is this?
everyone asks me what I'm doing in my retirement. Besides carving ducks and decoys and doing some writing, and I'm going to be doing a talk at the library on March 10th. I've been making homemade wine since 1971, and this is an '08 Petite Syrah from California. That's for you, Tony.
Okay, what is this? What
Petite Syrah. It's California grape, and my neighbor Ray Ambrose and I make wine every year. And now we have a whole slew of guys that come and make it with us and whatnot. But you can.
And you actually do this yourself?
Oh yeah.
Bottle it, the whole 9 yards?
Everything. Yeah. We stomp.
Is this going to become a commercial enterprise for you? or-
No. No, the federal government would look askance at that because we don't pay all the fees. But no, this is just for our own consumption.
I mean, you can make, what, the 50 gallons a year legally or something?
When we first started in '71, you had to be the male head of the family, and of course that's changed now.
Well, there's the wine connoisseur over there. Donald.
Okay.
Well, this is great.
Anyway, okay.
I really appreciate the time, Carl. It's been interesting. Like I said, I've done this with Gene Bishop. I did it with Frank Larkins. I did one with Ed actually years ago, and it's interesting for me to look back and get some of different perspectives on things that involve the growth of the town and where we were and where we are today. You got to know where you've been to know where you're going, I guess, right?
That's right.
Okay. Again, thanks very much. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Say hello to Linda.
I will.
And I appreciate
and
everything.
You to your family.
And with that, I also want to thank Donald Beckler for doing camera. He's a volunteer, as I am, as you know, with GCTV, and we're almost worn him out, but we're going to keep him going as cameraman. Thanks a lot, Donald. With that, this is Tony Fapiano. Thank you for watching.